Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Hello, I'm Anne McElvoy sitting in for Andrew Marr. We send him our very best wishes. And on the programme this morning, how should we value nature? I guess your view might depend on whether you're planning a stroll through a pristine landscape of new snow or just struggling through the weather to get to work this morning. So what has nature ever done for us? Tony Juniper, an environmentalist, has some answers to that question in a new book of the same title. It proposes an end to the feud between economists seeking growth and traditional greens. And he'll be telling me in a moment why he thinks money really does grow on trees. William Fiennes is an author whose award-winning memoir, The Snow Geese, celebrated the wonder and resilience of nature. Ngaire Woods is director of the Global Economic Governance Programme at Oxford, and the Conservative MP John Penrose has a solution to building thousands more houses, which, rather perversely, he starts by protecting the whole skyline. Tony, now tell me, what do you think nature can do for us that we don't value enough already?
Well, contrary to the views of some prominent individuals, what I've tried to set out in the book is not only how nature is extremely beautiful and necessary for protection for its own reasons, for its own intrinsic values, but also because of the huge economic value that it provides, which I think the data now says is essential for future growth, development and poverty reduction. I set out how nature is the world's largest water utility, how it's the principal means of conversion of solar energy on the planet. It's a massive carbon capture and storage system. It's a repository for solutions to design and engineering challenges designed through literally hundreds of millions of years of natural selection. It's an insurance policy, it's a health service, and it's a means to control diseases. All of those things we would normally buy in the market through different kinds of technology and public and private sector services. Nature's doing a lot of it for nothing, and if you add the value of all of that together, one estimate holds that the value of nature's services is about double global GDP, and yet you still find in the mainstream economic debate that there is this view that nature is a drag on development and growth. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I'm just smiling at your link of Mother Nature there to GDP, but we might come back to that and dig into that in a little while. But give us a concrete example of this. Some people say, well, gosh, you're saying there's a terrific value that we should put on nature, but what would that mean in practice? And where would you find a good example?
So consider the value of India's vultures. So these birds disappeared over the period between about 1992 and 2002, going from 40 million birds down to very few tens of thousands. The reason the vultures disappeared was the use of an anti-inflammatory drug in veterinary medicine. People using this on cattle and buffalo didn't realise that should residues of that material be left in cows when they died and vultures should eat them, the vultures died very quickly. So these birds were between them eating something like 12 million tonnes of putrefying flesh left in the countryside every year. And when the vultures disappeared because they were poisoned, that food was left for some other animals. And the principal beneficiary in this case was India's wild dog population, which soared by about 7 million animals. This led to more dog bites in the countryside in particular, and led to an estimated increase in rabies infections and a additional 50,000 deaths of people that wouldn't have occurred had the vultures still been there as a statistical analysis.
And you put an actual cost on this, didn't you?
Well, the researchers behind that piece of work that looked at the impact of vultures disappearing in India suggested this was worth about $34 billion. So the cost of the vultures disappearing to India's economy was $34 billion,
but that's
which is a huge number.
That's just something I wanted to dig into a little bit with you, is when people see a big figure like that,
yes,
put on a possible benefit
yes,
from nature in case of the argument that you're making. Surely the difficulty is attributing the responsibility and costs, because the farmers who inoculate their cattle for the gain of healthy cows, for instance, are not, they're not the same ones who are going to be killed by feral dogs.
No.
Or the population has risen since the loss of the vultures. There are many other factors. So how do you avoid the charge that you're just taking a figure from the air?
Well, I think economists are used to doing this, aren't they? Coming up with ballpark figures, applying the benefit broadly to society and then making choices. The trouble is that when it comes to nature, we simply do not factor this in. And, if you're looking for specific figures, then perhaps we should be making demands of that kind in terms of how economists make other judgments that we follow. And I don't see too many of them apologising for the numbers they got wrong that led to the financial crisis. We're embarking on an ecological crisis, and nobody's putting any numbers on it at all at the moment, and I think that's a massive oversight, and that's one of the principal messages of the book.
You've spent a lot of your life campaigning for the protection of the natural world and for intrinsic value, a sort of moral argument, if you like.
Yes.
Now you're moving to a more financially based argument. Do you feel that you lost the more general argument? You're kind of making it up on economic grounds.
Well, I've been making the economic argument ever since I began my career as an environmentalist. And I remember one of the things that struck me as I did my MSc in conservation back in the late 1980s, one of the most powerful things that was explained to me was wetlands delivering economic services in terms of purifying water and protecting property from flooding. It's really a question of the timing of the argument hitting the mainstream, and I think we've reached the point now where the data being gathered by the specialists is so overwhelmingly powerful that I do think we can begin to have a shift in opinions. And that's why I wrote the book, really, was to bring this set of knowledge to wider attention, because although this is now nailed down by the scientists and the economists, we still have this prevailing view expressed by people like George Osborne to the absolute contrary, that nature is a drag on growth and development. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think it's about the timing of the argument. And actually, I must say it's not either or. I believe nature is beautiful, needs protecting for its own intrinsic reasons, and it's economically vital for our future.
William Fiennes, you've written very movingly about the natural world, and we will come on to talk about that in a moment. But do you have a sense that the moral argument, arguing about the intrinsic value of nature, has been lost, and that we're now moving into this language of finance, for better or worse?
Well, I think, as Tony said, it's not either or, it's both and. And in many ways, one of the things that struck me reading Tony's book was that actually, in a way, he's restating in a new language quite an old and fundamental principle of ecology, which is the interconnectedness of all things. And the vulture example brings that out. It's as if we live in a Ngaire organism, and if one part of that organism goes out of kilter, that is going to have effects that ramify through the whole and are often unforeseen and so on.
But how do you feel about this language as a writer? I enjoyed reading your Snow Geese that you wrote over the weekend, and you really luxuriate in the language of nature. Well, this is a very different approach.
Well, it is, and I think it's another tool in the armoury. I mean, I think that a book like The Snow Geese, I don't have any a sense that it's going to have there's no overt polemical force in a book like The Snow Geese. I think what books are is they can be exercises in attention, and you can't care about something if you don't first notice it. And I think one thing that books can do, all forms of writing can do, is help people to notice. And I'd certainly worry if somebody read The Snow Geese and were then less attentive to the world around them, having read it. And there are examples of writers who've been sort of interested in the beauty of the natural world and interested in the beauty of the language they might use to describe it, and that's naturally led them into a sort of campaigning polemical energy. I mean, people like Rachel Carson and John Muir and so on.
I'm sure we'll come back to discussing that in a bit more detail. But John Penrose, if I could just bring you in here, Tony alluded to government and government policy there. It would appear that the Chancellor is not yet convinced of the economic benefits of nature as put forward in this kind of case. He said we're not going to save the planet by putting our country out of business. And that old tension does keep rearing its head, fairly.
I think that he's trying to make a slightly different point from Tony's. I mean, George's point, I think, is that Britain can't do this all on its own. There's no point in Britain being the only one wearing a hair shirt, because actually we could cut our carbon emissions dramatically, and China's increase in the number of coal-fired stations it's building would wipe that out in a matter of weeks. But what we can do and what we should do, and I think what George is on side on as well, is we need to make sure we're setting an example and we are trying to walk the talk. And actually, in Tony's defence, I think you were being probably a little bit harsh on him by saying that the ethical and aesthetic argument's been lost here. I think the ethical and aesthetic argument's really strong, but Tony's absolutely right to say that the time is now for bringing in the economic argument as well. And you've only got to look at what's happening with people trying to develop carbon prices to deal with things like global warming to understand that it's incredibly economically tricky and detailed and complicated to get right. but it is a kind of language which therefore means you can talk to the whole world rather than just to one slice of it. It's very powerful indeed.
Well, let's talk to the whole world through Ngaire Woods, who's here. You're an economist and look specifically at global governments. Are you convinced that natural capital, this idea, can make an impact?
Yeah, so I am interested in how you move from the kinds of arguments that Tony's making to how you actually govern them. So, I'm Dean of a School of Government at Oxford University. We're interested in what does it mean for government. And, I'll never eat an oyster again, Tony, thanks to you. Learning from
There's quite a lot of things you may not do again after readings, but there's also some things that you
But I
would
learnt
do.
from Tony's book that one modest little oyster filters 200 litres of water a day. And there's great power in his explanation to us about how the natural world has these management and coping mechanisms that we often ignore. And I think actually that the descriptions do better than the numbers. I think the numbers help grab attention. But, it was like reading Williams' essay on the ash tree. I'll never look at an ash tree again that way, because what that writing does is inspire you and set a goal. But then the question is, I think there's a tendency for people to say, well, because these are all interconnected problems and global, we need global rules, or we need central government to act. And that's where I would pose some big questions. There was a wonderful political economist, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize last year. And her work was dedicated to looking at how, in practice, do we manage these things? How do we manage oyster beds? How do we manage ecological systems? And one of the powerful lessons in her work is that it's got to be local. You've got to go to a local community. Often it's local communities that know about these protective qualities and that want to protect them. And it's there in a local community with the whole community participating that you can start to create rules and enforcement, and that we should only look to central and global government when we need backup parameters.
But can I just ask you on central government, is there any evidence that these big figures that are being bandied about now in this argument, X billion being put down to whether you have, keep your vulture population alive or not, do these figures make any difference if people can't see where the cost falls?
Well, I think so. On the one hand, I think they are, as was said before, they sit among lots of figures. So the government that's looking at the cost of vultures dying in India is also looking at the profits of Novartis, the company that produced the drug, the tax revenue that might accrue from that, the benefits to the farmers from healthier cows, as you mentioned. There are a lot of dazzling figures there. The important thing about ecologists coming up with figures is that it helps governments conduct a wider cost-benefit analysis. But the note of scepticism I would sound is an assumption that governments around the world proceed on the basis of evidence. And John could talk to this, but actually, although it's really important to have evidence, and as a researcher that's key to my own belief system, governments just as often proceed by anecdote. So the stories, the inspiration, those anecdotes are actually really important to the business of government as well.
I should say, Tony, that there are not only negative or scary examples in your book. You discuss in detail at Costa Rica where the rush for resources and growth potential hasn't entirely trumped the environment argument.
No. And so that's the other job I try to do in What Has Nature Ever Done for Us is to explore some of the things that are already being done to show that it is actually possible to convert an understanding of the ecological value of economics into practical things that countries, companies and communities can actually do. And you mentioned the example of Costa Rica. I think that's a very powerful example because that country during the late 1970s was rapidly deforesting. Not least to make way for cattle ranches to feed the North American demand for beef for the fast food industry. And the country became concerned that this was going to cause damage to its economic base, and over a period began to develop metrics based on, for example, tourism revenues and also the water that the forests were capturing, which were powering hydroelectric dams, which were basically the country's principal power source. More recently, carbon has been added to the list of values there. And that country, between now and the late 1980s, has not only doubled its forest cover, it's also doubled its per capita GDP, showing that there isn't necessarily a trade-off between improving people's lives, welfare and their comfort, whilst at the same time not only conserving ecological systems, but in that case actually improving them. So it can be done, and there's plenty of examples from different parts of the world, some on a small scale, some on a larger scale, but I think that the proof is there, and I do try to put that across in order to inspire people to see that it's not simply a theoretical argument about numbers, it actually does lead to real-world opportunities.
Now, you've looked at sustainability in a global context, but also how the approach that governments now take to it. Tony's view seems to be that the environment must be at the centre of things. He's interpreted it variously and come up with a new way of doing so in the book. But would you agree that sustainability can really be at the heart of what modern governments do? Or is that a little bit of wishful thinking from the Greens, whether they're of an older generation or the modernisers in the Green movement today?
Well, I think the big conflict about it that I see at the global level concerns industrialised countries who realise that poorer countries wanting to industrialise are finding that the cheapest way to do that is the most environmentally unfriendly. Burn tons of coal, industrialise quickly, get economic growth. And so the industrialised countries are trying to tell poorer countries, you must not do that, because that will create climate change that will adversely affect us all. And poorer countries and emerging economies are coming back and saying, who are you to tell us how to develop? You've burnt all your coal and you are continuing to do so. So you have no grounds to tell poorer countries that they can't do this to develop. And the next stage of the debate is then, OK, then we will pay you to use cleaner energy, which is economically rational. We should pay poorer countries to mitigate climate change that sometimes political factors stop us doing. The problem in global negotiations is that having opened that debate, industrialised countries have very quickly backpedaled out of it. Yeah. And the money they're willing to put on the table is tiny. So in the end, what poorer countries and emerging economies are facing are conditions being set by industrialised countries who are not themselves doing clean energy, but are finding that the United States and Europe are telling them that they must only use clean means and that they must pay the additional cost. And if you're the government of a small, very poor country, you can't afford that.
John Penrose.
I completely agree with that. I think that is a really good summary of where the debate is at the moment. And an awful lot of it can only be cleaned up by this notion of getting genuinely objective information and facts about what the costs of this stuff are. And part of the trouble is that everybody, policymakers and everybody else, who, even if they're trying to take a rational choice, an evidence-based choice, rather than just something which is based on anecdote, people feel like they're groping in the dark because an awful lot of these numbers either aren't available at all, or people are only just starting to understand what the costs of doing X will be. And therefore, there's all sorts of unintended consequences, some of which only happen, you only notice 20, 30, 40 years after you've taken a particular course of action. And therefore, this is still quite new science. It's certainly quite new public policy making in terms of the way that we as a race, planet-wide, think. And therefore, we aren't very good at this yet because we just don't have the information in front of us.
And what about the politics of it? Because the difference between you and the other people around the table is you have to go out and get elected, re-elected.
For my sins, yes.
For your sins and your party's sins. Yeah. So you do have this problem that it's easy for people, public policy makers or environmentalists, to tell politicians maybe what would be a very good thing to do. But it's difficult, isn't it, for governments to make the case for long-term plans when, even in our own country, families are suffering now and they want reassurance and kind of insurance that things are not going to get more difficult for them.
But you're right that in a time of austerity, people tend to get quite reductive. They tend to think that some things are fripperies and nice to haves rather than essentials. And I think Tony's absolutely right to say, no, just some things are long-term essentials as opposed to immediate essentials. You can't ignore this stuff. So you're absolutely right. Those are short-term pressures. They'll be with us for as long as the austerity regime is with us here. But nonetheless, I still have this huge faith that if you explain things properly and you've got genuine evidence, some facts you can put in front of people, things that the Times and the Daily Mail and the BBC can put in front of people and make the case, then people actually get it really fast. People want to be sustainable. You've only got to look at the way that we've all changed our own habits just in the course of the last few years in recycling. If you asked people 15 years ago, do you recycle your rubbish? Most of them would have thought you were a bit of a flake. Now it's absolutely normal. People want to do this, but you've got to make the case for us all. We're not stupid, but we do need facts.
Indeed, and I think that cultural connection between these ecological subjects and how that reflects back into politics is really quite crucial. And again, hopefully this is one of the things that the book will contribute to, is a wider understanding and awareness of these economic values in a way which will enable politicians to start moving into a different space and talking differently about these things. And it's interesting actually to note that the British Treasury now has a so-called Natural Capital Committee advising ministers. And over the next few years, if we begin to unpack these numbers and these ideas in ways that can start to translate into ideas that politicians can back, we might see see some quite rapid progress. But I think, as I said earlier on, these ideas, they find their own moment. And I think on this subject, we've just arrived at it.
But sometimes nature finds its own moment, and not always in a way that's welcome to us. So let's talk about an issue you raised in the book, which affected a lot of parts of the country last year, and that's flooding.
Yes.
And the question of long-term natural defences, and whether the alternatives that proposes. Now, if we need to put a lot more resource into long-term prevention of flooding, who do you get to pay? Is this one for the insurance companies? Is it the poor old taxpayer again?
I think it requires a joined-up approach. And if you look at some of the flood events...
that always means what?
Joined-up
approach. I'd like someone to pay my joined-up bills.
So, for example, at the moment, we spend something like £3 billion a year on agricultural subsidies in the United Kingdom. Would it not be possible to target those subsidies in ways that help land to absorb water rather than to shed it very quickly? And there's other money being used in the forestry sector. There are incentives to conserve peat bogs. Those are official subsidies that are there already and incentives. You could make the case for some small contribution from the insurance companies too, because it's in their interest to reduce risk and to reduce losses. And if you start to put that kind of funding together, you can see some big opportunities here and in many parts of the world to enhance ecosystems to reduce flood risk by absorbing more water and reducing the runoff after the immediate event. And
you don't just see another sort of wind farms argument looming where we end up with sounds like a very good green idea and quite quickly shades into an argument about what do we actually get back from it, and indeed is it not just yet another subsidy that is handed out to some people.
Well, my point is that the subsidies are already there and it's a question of redirecting them and using them for a more joined up set of outcomes. And so if we can see ways in which landowners can be incentivised to do more than one thing at once, I think that will be in the public interest in the sense of how we get real value for money. And who's going to argue about restoring the health of woodlands and peat bogs? I think it's much less controversial than renewable energy. And not only actually do we get the water services, if we enhance our peat bogs, we get carbon capture as well.
It's not controversial so much as the worst case analysis, you can't put a date on it. It's in the future. It may or may not happen. It's a risk. And Ngaire, that does seem to be, that is the problem, isn't it? That so many of these things, not something to say, if you don't do something by next December, something even worse will happen by the following March. How do you get to change mindsets, or can you change mindsets in terms of public policy and decisions that people readily take on consequences earlier?
Well, I think people are constantly looking for the big bullet, the big magic bullet. Let's persuade the whole world to move on climate change now, because there'll be a catastrophe very soon if we don't. And I think actually we've had a run at that, and it doesn't work very well.
You're thinking of things like Kyoto and Copenhagen and these attempts to get all governments to come and sign a piece of paper and go away and do it.
Absolutely, and which has a lot of people then saying, oh no, we'll find a geoengineering solution, catastrophe will be averted, and those making the case for catastrophe start sounding like the sort of Mayans that told us that the world would end, in December. I think what becomes really important, as I alluded to before, is that you get a political process which really engages the local community and has them participating in it, and that politicians don't simply speak. The role that politicians play is a really important one, because, as Tony said, on the one hand, they will be faced with companies who would like certain contracts, but on the other, they can be a voice to a community that helps to mobilise a particular community. And you do see it in one New York borough, for example. Instead of building a new, very expensive dam, and there were some companies lining up for that very lucrative contract, a couple of decades ago, instead they, at the taxpayers' expense, they replaced all the toilets in that borough to use far less water. And in so doing, they averted building a large dam with a lot of associated environmental damage. So it's possible. And I actually think that the process that's being used, the ensuring that the local community can come together and inform themselves, ensuring politicians are informing on both sides of the equation.
This strikes me as an interesting way in which the green argument is changing, or at least changing for some people. It sounds like you don't have a lot of faith in the idea of going back and doing a Kyoto, Copenhagen, wherever the next great government shebang would be, that you would rather leave these kind of the big set-piece summits behind and go local.
Yeah, the big set-piece summits can help focus attention. they should only be used for those things which absolutely cannot be done at the local level. And what I'm seeing is politicians at local levels and national levels throwing up their hands and saying, well, we can't do anything until there's a global agreement. That's very dangerous, because the global agreement is the hardest of all to get. So you're far better to start at the local and then leave for the global only that which absolutely can't be done anywhere else.
Well, if Tony's book is an attempt to change attitudes to the natural world with an argument about practical benefits, I guess I'm wondering whether purloining the language of finance can move people to protect nature. And another approach, which some people favour, has been dubbed landscape literature, and that's celebrating nature more evocatively. I've just been reading Robert Macfarlane's book on walking the old ways, and writers like Mark Cocker and the poet Kathleen Jamie are also ploughing this furrow. William Fiennes, you wrote The Snow Geese a decade ago when these subjects felt perhaps a bit less fashionable than they do now. What inspired your decision to embed yourself so totally in nature on your odyssey with the geese?
Well, you are right to say that in some ways these things weren't so fashionable in those days. I mean, when I started writing The Snow Geese in around 2000, I didn't really feel I had a lot of British models of writing about the natural world. It's interesting you use the term landscape literature, and often people talk about nature writing, and I've always been a little bit suspicious of those terms. I mean, as Jim Hamilton said, to talk about nature writing is like talking about water swimming, and we are nature too, so what other kind of writing is there? And I think that in a way, even in having those sort of generic labels, it slightly reinforces...
It puts it in a niche, doesn't it?
Well, and
you
it
can
also...
see a library shelf somewhere dustily entitled Nature Writing.
Yeah, exactly. But it also reinforces, in a way, a schism between human beings and the rest of the natural world, which I think is at the root of many of the problems that Tony is addressing. But for me, there were British books like The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, which I was enthralled by, but mostly there was a North American tradition of writing about the natural world, which really came from Henry Thoreau and Melville and Ralph Emerson. And then more recently, I was enthralled by writers like Barry Lopez and Annie Dillard and John Muir and Aldo Leopold and Wendell Berry. There was this incredibly vibrant tradition of American nature writing that was partly to do, I think, with how the essay was thriving as a form in North America. But the actual immediate impulse for writing The Snow Geese was being very ill and spending a lot of time in hospital, which was in a way for me a kind of closing down of experience. And The Snow Geese is the story of somebody having had all of their experience closed down, wanting to go out into the world and sort of gulp it down and register a sense of wonder and beauty and awe. And although I loved those books that were about, their primary focus was the non-human world, I wanted to pay attention to everything and have the book as full of people talking and people's characteristics as it was of bird behaviour and bat
yes,
behaviour.
you observe
and other
human
things.
behaviour just as minutely as you observe those wonderful passages about the sounds of the wings of the flapping geese en masse, but then you will also look at the zipper on somebody's jacket.
Well, this maybe sounds kind of grandiloquent, but I wanted to have, as it were, a comprehensive way of seeing the world that took on all of those things. And I do think it's an important sort of ecological principle that we understand that we are part of a continuum, that we inhabit the same world. I mean, actually, nature is a realm where this phrase is slightly discredited, but where it really is true to say of nature that we're all in this together. I mean, there's a moment in The Snow Geese where there's a man who's been tracking bald eagles across North America and has gone to see them, and he says somewhere that, they depend on the same things that we do, and if they can't make it, then we sure as hell can't either. I think it's what I'm saying when Tony's book incredibly valuably, I think, articulates in a new language quite an old principle of ecology and conservation, which is the interconnectedness of all things, that we inhabit the same space.
Trees also played a big role in your writing, and also in the way that you see this interrelation of man and nature. You wrote a wonderful fable, Why the Ash Has Black Buds, for a book for the Woodland Trust, which is the trees become aware of what they're used for, from stockades to joists and beams and chess pieces and books. And I started reading it thinking, this is going to be one of those please don't cut down the trees, sort of German sort of green thinking of the 1970s, of the wood is dying.
Yeah.
But actually, you go somewhere very different with it. You go to a much more positive conclusion about what the tree is doing for us, and that it's part of our everyday life, even if we're not standing in a forest.
Yes, and I'm particularly attached to trees and excited by trees. I mean, and Tony touches on it. Actually, I think one of the things I love about trees is that when you plant a tree, you're thinking about time in a different way. When you plant a tree, you're actually directly implicated in what the world is going to feel like and look like in 100 years' time or 200 years' time. And maybe that goes to what John was talking about the clash of timescales. Yes. The sort of profits that Tony are talking about coming from nature may take a long time to play out, whereas the kind of profits that businesses are looking for and maybe politicians look for in their 5-yearly cycles happen on a much shorter timescale. And it may be that part of the problem is that we need to change our understanding of time.
Tony, you're nodding vigorously.
Yes, and in large part that then in turn comes down to the extent to which we value certain aspects of nature which we can see in the market, and other values which are hugely valuable economically which are not yet visible in the market. And so a forest will naturally be seen as a source of timber, but less often is it seen as a source of water, a way of capturing carbon dioxide, or a repository of biological diversity, which in the future could be hugely valuable in medicine, engineering and design and everything else. And it's about leaping that schism into understanding that wider set of values and bringing them into policy. And this is where it gets tricky, actually, and Ngaire's right, in the extent to which there is a difference between, on the one hand, valuing nature and then finding the mechanisms to reflect that value in how we do business. And so some of the things that we've done for quite a long time are quite familiar. For example, national parks and restricting certain chemicals being released into the environment. We do that through regulation and through decisions made by government. But if we're going to capture this wider set of values, then there is some quite controversial discussion to be had. There's some controversial choices there in the sense of, do we do payments for ecosystem services? Do we do biodiversity offsetting and these kinds of tools?
I'm pleased you mentioned payments and offsetting. Now, you see, this is a kind of language which for some people takes them quite a long way from why they value nature in the first place, whatever the pros and cons of Tony's case. And as a writer and as someone, as you say, who wanted to go back to that more integral connection between man and nature, do you regret to an extent the fact that the debate has moved or has had to move in this direction where it does sound a bit pound, shilling and pence?
Well, I would regret it if that was the only language we spoke. And I don't think Tony wants that to be the only language we speak. I don't think any of us would. But it's something I notice as well in the arts do have to do the same thing. Increasingly, it's not enough to say that our imagination, our creativity is a wonderful thing. We should be pouring public resources into that. The arts have to make the same economic case.
But they run into the same difficulty that sometimes when they put on big figures on things, that you then end up in this argument about whether Ngaire's have got a finger up in the air here. I mean, whether the projections are correct. So you end up in this slightly grindish argument.
Well, I don't think they're so far away. I love William's expression, exercises in paying attention, because I think actually probably that's what the numbers are trying to do, is grab attention. And I think there is this more profound and inspiring way to do it, which is through writing like William's. And I loved the way in your work, William, the other paying attention that you're doing, which is taking your first story work into schools, because it's the same thing. In other words, what he's seeing through his work, getting quite excluded young children to think about and tell their own story, is getting them to pay attention to themselves and then seeing the impacts of that on literacy. And, so you could, a different approach, and one very popular in development, is to think about things like conditional payments. So let's pay the child or pay the parent for achieving certain levels. And that is one way to do it. But I think what he's onto is a very different way that has a quiet and surprising rate of success.
Well, I think that I'm so glad to hear that. But I think that certainly in what I do with First Story, which is promoting creativity and promoting writing in challenging secondary schools, really. And I was thinking about that a lot reading Tony's book, because one of the nice things about it is the way he spotlights people doing very inventive and creative things, from the team in Cambridge making a solar-powered car to the people who worked out the biosphere experiment, which is extraordinary, to the very conscientious and rather surprising way that PG Tips is grown in East Africa, I think it was.
Yes,
I mean, there were some brilliant things in there, and I was thinking if you were to do an economic analysis on human creativity, the calculator would just explode.
Yes.
And I worry about the lack of creative opportunities in schools, which is something that First Story is particularly addressing. But I do notice this language creeping into the arts as well. Even just last week, the playwright Lee Hall was making an amazing speech in Newcastle about the cuts to the arts budget there and the closure of libraries in Newcastle. And he started with the arguments from principle and the great sense of wonder in reading and meeting with books and meeting with imaginative experience. And then he said, for every 1.5 million spent on the arts in Newcastle, it brings in 20 million in business and tourism. So that language is getting everywhere. And I what I like is seeing those languages alongside each other. I think it's absolutely right that, especially where public money is being spent and charities are asking for money from donors, that they're as rigorous as they can be in gathering data and monitoring and evaluating. But I think if that was the only language that we all spoke, then
we'd be very narrow people.
We would be diminished.
We would be the poorer for it. Now, one of the issues that goes to the heart of the debate about nature and development is, of course, housing, the conundrum of how do you preserve one while providing more of the other, the homes that people want for themselves and for their families. Well, last week the government suggested it would offer incentives to communities who allow housing development in their areas. There's a target of around 270,000 new homes a year. John Penr is an MP, indeed a former Minister of Heritage, no less. This is one of the choices politicians can rarely get right, isn't it? And it historically has caused more pain to seating MPs than almost any other issue.
Yes. Absolutely. But one of the things I'm trying to put across is that there's an enormous amount which is good about our towns and our cities as well. And so while you're trying to strike that balance, we need to make sure that we don't lose the beauty and the stuff that makes our towns and cities good places to live in the process. And what we've got is towns and cities now which are, most of them, several centuries old, and many of them very beautiful, not just in a formal way, not just in the way that you'll find if you go to Bath's Royal Crescent, excuse me, or to the Mall in London, but also in an informal way. Just, I'm willing to bet anybody listening to your programme this morning will think of their local walk where they take the dog in the morning or where they take the children on a Sunday afternoon. There'll be something about it, the bandstand in the local park, the local town square, where it just works, even though it's not a formal view, and it's worth preserving. We want to hang on to that. We don't want to build all over that or knock down the good bits.
But that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because that's the argument of beauty being in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. But what you have proposed is approved views or a list of views which we would touch at our peril. But doesn't that exactly throw up the question that you raised, that some people will find beauty in perhaps bits of land that other people might just find scraggy and quite happily build a great big condominium on if they could?
Well, yes and no. And I'm sorry to sort of hedge my bets there a bit, but what we do at the moment, we already have some protections in there. So we list individual buildings if they're very old, very special, and particularly important, made by a particular architect. We already do that, and there's 5% or so of the Britain's buildings are protected in that way, so you can't muck them around. We have conservation areas and those sorts of things too, and even some specific views. I mean, to take a famous example, you have to be able to see St Paul's, the dome of St Paul's Cathedral, from various different points around London, including the hill on Hampstead Heath and various other things. So we do that already. What we don't do is we don't say, look, there are other small-scale, informal, surprising little bits of beauty which are equally valuable in a small scale, and we've got no way of spotting them and preserving them. So I don't want some sort of big, long list of stuff thou shalt never touch at one's peril, but I do think we need to have some way of recognising and identifying this stuff which is special, so that when somebody comes along and says, I want to put a whopping great big skyscraper here, and we can either say, yep, that's fine, it's not getting in the way of anything that's special, or alternatively, hang on a minute, there's something which no one has bothered to write down before which is worth keeping, and we need to have a mechanism to preserve it, please, now.
I think you're going to set off a lot of very interesting local rows with this.
But that's a conversation which hasn't happened yet. That's important.
So you want the conversation, but ultimately, a list has to have a beginning and an end, and it has to have some things that get missed off it, and that's then where the rows would commence.
You're absolutely right. I mean, what happens at the moment, for example, if we list an individual building, English Heritage has this thing called the Principles for Selection that says, look, if you're going to list a building, it's got to satisfy a series of criteria, and then if someone thinks a building might, you can nominate it to be listed, and English Heritage will say yes it does or no it doesn't. Fairly straightforward. Now, if there's a set of criteria which we can do that for individual buildings, and we do, why don't we start having to think about what that might be for some kinds of views? It's hard, I grant you, but there's beauty out there which we're just ignoring at the moment, and we're probably casually destroying. And since we spend most of our times in life in towns and cities,
could I just squeeze one little answer out of you before we move on, which is how would that help create lots and lots of houses? You just have a very long discussion about lovely views.
Well, because if you know what you're keeping, you also know what you don't mind if it changes. And that frees up an awful lot of stuff in areas of city centres that need regenerating. People can't stop you then if actually this is not something which is satisfying these criteria. You can get on with it faster. You don't have people trying to stop you.
Does this idea appeal to you, Tony?
Well, I think one of the things that we do need to do in seizing the maximum benefit from nature is to design our urban areas differently. And one of the things I talk about at some length in the book is the benefits that people gain from being exposed to green space, to bird song and to wild places. And since most of us live in cities, naturally, therefore, this is where we should be focusing on enhancing people's lives through incorporating greenery into the design of how we build the places where most of us live. And again, there's some really big numbers on this. And one study showing how there's a difference in average health outcomes of about 5 years between those people exposed to greenery in their day-to-day lives and those who are not.
It sounds like you'd leave most of the views on your list then. How do you feel about this idea of listing views? Officially approved ones, if you like.
Well, I think that is a problem, and John's alive to it, that you can't have a sort of a little quango who's deciding what's good for us and what isn't. But I do think that, just to take an example, something like the Shard, which has had such an impact on the London skyline, I'm kind of interested to know the mechanism that allowed that to be there. There wasn't a feeling that Londoners, who in a way should have some say in their skyline, were exactly consulted on what it looked like.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, my concern with this and with all the areas of public policy we've been looking at is that they're not held hostage either by a specific lobby group or an interest group or a specific set of developers or companies or political interests. So the process of decisions is really important, but also the transparency of the process afterwards, the ability of a community to access how the decision was made and who had influence on it.
Well, there we must come to our natural conclusion. Many thanks to all my guests today, the MP John Penrose, Ngaire Woods, who's Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, William Fiennes, whose fable about the ash tree is in a collection for the Woodlands Trust called Why Willows Weep, and Tony Juniper's book, What Has Nature Ever Done For Us, is out now. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe will be in the chair to explore 40,000 years of musical history with John Adams, Howard Goodall and Stephen Polyarkov. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Making. Surely the difficulty is attributing the responsibility and costs, because the farmers who inoculate their cattle for the gain of healthy cows, for instance, are not, they're not the same ones who are going to be killed by feral dogs.
No.
Or the population has risen since the loss of the vultures. There are many other factors. So how do you avoid the charity? Or just taking a figure from the air?
Well, I think economists are used to doing this, aren't they? Coming up with ballpark figures, applying the benefit broadly to society and then making choices. The trouble is that when it comes to nature, we simply do not factor this in. And, if you're looking for specific figures, then perhaps we should be making demands of that kind in terms of how economists make other judgments that we follow. And I don't see too many of them apologising for the numbers they got wrong that led to the financial crisis. We're embarking on an ecological crisis and nobody's putting any numbers on it at all at the moment, and I think that's a massive oversight, and that's one of the principal messages of the book.
You've spent a lot of your life campaigning for the protection of the natural world and for intrinsic value.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Hello, I'm Anne McElvoy sitting in for Andrew Marr. We sent him our very best wishes. And on the programme this morning, how should we value nature? I guess your view might depend on whether you're planning a stroll through a pristine landscape of new snow or just struggling through the weather to get to work this morning. So what has nature ever done for us? Tony Juniper, an environmentalist, has some answers to that question in a new book of the same title. It proposes an end to the feud between economists seeking growth and traditional greens. And he'll be telling me in a moment why he thinks money really does grow on trees. William Fiennes is an author whose award-winning memoir, The Snow Geese, celebrated the wonder and resilience of nature. Ngaire Woods is director of the Global Economic Governance Programme at Oxford, and the Conservative MP John Penrose has a solution to building thousands more houses, which, rather perversely, he starts by
nothing. And if you add the value of all of that together, one estimate holds that the value of nature's services is about double global GDP. And yet you still find in the mainstream economic debate that there is this view that nature is a drag on development and growth. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I'm just smiling at your link of Mother Nature there to GDP, but we might come back to that and dig into that in a little while. But give us a concrete example of this. Some people say, well, gosh, you're saying there's a terrific value that we should put on nature, but what would that mean in practice? And where would you find a good example?
So consider the value of India's vultures. So these birds disappeared over the period between about 1992 and 2002, going from 40 million birds down to very few tens of thousands. The reason the vultures disappeared was the use of an anti-inflammatory drug in veterinary medicine. People using this on cattle and buffalo didn't realise that should residues of that material be left in cows when they died, and vultures should eat...
Protecting the whole skyline. Tony, now tell me, what do you think nature can do for us that we don't value enough already?
Well, contrary to the views of some prominent individuals, what I tried to set out in the book is not only how nature is extremely beautiful and necessary for protection for its own reasons, for its own intrinsic values, but also because of the huge economic value that it provides, which I think the data now says is essential for future growth, development and poverty reduction. I set out how nature is the world's largest water utility, how it's the principal means of conversion of solar energy on the planet. It's a massive carbon capture and storage system. It's a repository for solutions to design and engineering challenges designed through literally hundreds of millions of years of natural selection. It's an insurance policy, it's a health service, and it's a means to control diseases. All of those things we would normally buy in the market through different kinds of technology and public and private sector services. Nature's doing a lot of it for them. The vultures died very quickly. So these birds were between them eating something like 12 million tonnes of putrefying flesh left in the countryside every year. And when the vultures disappeared because they were poisoned, that food was left for some other animals. And the principal beneficiary in this case was India's wild dog population, which soared by about 7 million animals. This led to more dog bites in the countryside in particular, and led to an estimated increase in rabies infections and a additional 50,000 deaths of people that wouldn't have occurred had the vultures still been there. It's a statistical analysis.
And you put an actual cost on this, didn't
Well,
you?
the researchers behind that piece of work that looked at the impact of vultures disappearing in India suggested this was worth about $34 billion. So the cost of the vultures disappearing to India's economy was $34 billion,
But that's
which
actually
is a huge number.
That's just something I wanted to dig into a little bit with you, is when people see a big figure like that,
Yes.
put on a possible benefit
Yes.
from nature, in case of the argument that you